Imagine this, you wake up, and you're not in your room. There's no phone, no city noise, no lights, just the sound of wind, an old wooden house. And your hands weathered, scarred, unfamiliar. You're not yourself anymore. You are a samurai. Old, alone, near the end. All around you are scrolls letters you wrote across a lifetime. To people you lost, to moments you can't get back, and maybe to someone like you who never expected to be here. Tonight, you'll walk through a life you never lived, but somehow feel like you remember, step by step, letter by letter, until the final one. This is the samurai's last letter, but the story doesn't end with him. It continues with you. The climb took longer than it should have. Your legs ached. The sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the stone path. It wasn't the sort of trail people used anymore, narrow, half swallowed by moss, branches reaching. And like they were trying to pull you back, you kept going anyway. You didn't know what brought you here. Maybe it was the dream from last night. The sound of water, a soft voice saying your name. Though no one was there, maybe it was the story your grandfather told you years ago, about a temple where the wind remembered everything. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Something older, something waiting at the top, the trees. Opened into light, and there it was. The temple stood like a sleeping guardian. Wooden beams aged to silver gray, tiles curled and cracked, but it hadn't fallen. It had endured. You stepped inside. The silence was immediate, deep, the kind that presses against your chest. Dust floated through beams of golden light. A stone lantern sat in the far corner, unlit for decades, and in the center of the room, resting on a low altar of blackened cedar, was the box, lacquered red, wrapped in faded silk, no lock, no markings, but the moment you saw it, you knew. You knelt. Your hands moved slowly, almost reverently, untying the silk cord. The wood was cool beneath your fingers. The lid lifted without a sound. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper had aged, round at the edges, but the brushstrokes were still clear. Fluid, sharp, intentional. You hesitated, and then you began to read, "To the one who carries my soul now." The words felt like they were being whispered into your ear. I am long gone, but if you are reading this, then my spirit has found its way home. I do not ask for your grief. I ask only for your time. Let my story pass through you. Let it not be forgotten. You looked up for a moment. A breeze had found its way into the temple. It brushed against your neck, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and old smoke. You weren't alone here. Not really. You went back to the letter. My name was Tamo Arakawa. I was a samurai, but I do not ask you to remember me for the battles I fought, or the blood I spilled, or the titles I wore. I ask you to remember me because I lived, because I loved, because I lost. You didn't know what to expect? A war story? A confession? Something legendary? But it didn't read like legend. It read like truth. I was not born to a noble family. My father carved arrows for the soldiers who walked past our door and gave them to me to balance on my fingers. My mother sang songs to the moon when the wind kept her from sleeping. And my sister, she laughed like rain. I still hear it sometimes when it rains just right. A quiet shiver passed through you. You kept reading. They say we are born into the world like leaves, free, light, unknowing. But in time, duty bends us. Honor binds us. And before we know it, we are carried downstream by a river we cannot fight. I was 14 when I picked up a wooden practice sword and struck my first stance. My teacher called me reckless. I called it courage. But time has a way of teaching you what the blade never can. The way he wrote, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't proud. It was reflective, gentle. The words pulled you in like an evening tide, steady and slow. I served Lord Hanzo of the Eastern Wind. He was not the strongest daimyo, not the richest, but he believed in the balance of things, in soft power, in planting trees even when war scorched the sky. I gave him my oath not because he demanded it, but because I saw something rare in him. Stillness. There was a pause in the letter. A space, as if he were remembering something too big for words. He taught me that the sword is not a weapon, it is a question. Each time you draw it, you are asking the world, is this necessary? And if the world answers no, then sheathe it. You let that settle in your chest for a while. You weren't even sure you were breathing. I followed him through 6 campaigns. I buried friends. I stood watch over burning villages. I carried men who could no longer walk. I saw honor, and I saw the lies told in its name. The light in the temple had softened now. Stained golden orange by the falling sun, shadows crept across the tatami mats. I do not write this to boast or to wallow. I write this because I want you to understand what you inherit is not glory. It is weight. It is wind pressing against your back when you do not know where to go. It is silence when others shout. You looked out the open shoshi screen beside you. The valley below was washed in gold. Birds wheeled lazily above the trees. There was something deeply human about what you were holding. Not a relic, not a record, a heartbeat. I do not know your name, I do not know your face, but I know this. If this letter has found you, then there is something in you that still listens. Something quiet, something true. Carry it. Another breeze entered the room, brushing gently against your cheek. The letter ended simply, more will follow. If your heart remains open, you will find them. I have placed my life in pieces, hidden where only silence walks. You will know when you are ready. For now, rest. You lowered the letter. The world had gone quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full. The box still held something. Else a worn cloth, a sliver of incense, and beneath it, the faint glimmer of steel. You didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, you bowed, slow and deep, your forehead touching the floor. Outside, the sky turned to fire. The mountain wind stirred, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, you closed your eyes. And slept. You woke before the sun. The wind outside had quieted. For a moment, you weren't sure where you were. Just the soft scent of cedar in your nose. The feel of ancient wood beneath your back. Then you saw the letter beside you, folded neatly, as if it had placed itself there again in the night. You sat up slowly. Your joints ached from sleeping on the floor, but there was a strange lightness. In your chest, like something that had been tangled for years, had quietly begun to unravel. You picked up the box again. The silk wrapping had loosened in the night, and beneath the letter, you found a second scroll shorter, bound in black thread. There was no title, no greeting, just ink. And you read, if you are reading this, you have chosen to walk with me a little farther. This is not a path of warriors or heroes. This is a path of memory. And memory, my friend, does not always take kind shapes. You touched the edge of the scroll. A soft breeze passed through. The open shoshi, the world outside the temple, was still blanketed in silver mist. My name is Tomo Arakawa. That name has meant many things in my life. To some, it meant protector. To others, butcher. To a few, brother. I was named after my grandmother, Tomo Gozen, a woman who wore her armor like a second skin and rode into battle with the fury of a storm. But I was never her equal. I was quieter, slower to anger. I never wanted the glory. When I was 10, I watched my father burn his name from the family registry. You blinked. You hadn't expected that. He said that names are only useful until they're not. When a name becomes a target, it becomes a wound. So he let ours vanish. He chose silence over pride. That day, I stopped being a child. I watched. Our crest, the hawk in flight, curl into black ash in the brazier. My mother wept. My sister turned away. I stood still. The words pressed against your chest like a hand that wouldn't let go. After that, We lived like ghosts. We moved through villages without making sound. My father hunted at night. My mother stitched banners for men she would never meet. My sister began to speak only to the trees. I practiced with a wooden sword behind the house, using shadows as my opponent. The picture he painted was vivid, haunting. You saw him a quiet boy with sharp eyes, learning to cut through silence. Instead of men, watching the world, but not yet part of it. I was 15 when the war came. No fanfare in the words, no build-up, just that. I remember the sky being red with smoke for 3 days. I remember the way the crows circled, feasting on what the soldiers left behind. I remember my sister running barefoot through the snow to warn the neighbors, her voice cracking like bamboo in the wind. And I remember the first man I killed. You swallowed hard. There was a pause in the writing there. You could almost feel it, the moment his brush stopped, hovering over the page, a memory too heavy to press into ink, but too real to ignore. He wore a helmet too big for his head. I don't think he was older than I was. Maybe younger. He had fear in his eyes, not anger, not hatred, just fear. He didn't raise his sword fast enough. I don't even remember deciding to strike. I just remember the sound. A name is easy to burn. A life is not. A temple creaked in the quiet. Outside, a crow called once, then stopped, as if in mourning. That night, I sat in the snow for hours. I waited for someone to come for me, my mother, my lord, the gods, but no one came. I buried the boy. I dug with my bare hands until my nails cracked and bled. I placed a stone over his chest and whispered a name for him. One I made up because I didn't know his real one. That name is mine now too. My name is Tamo Arakawa, but I have lived under other names. Some I gave to myself. Some were given to me. All of them live in ash. The scroll ended there. No farewell, no signature. Just that final sentence, written darker than the rest, like he pressed harder with the brush. Or maybe his hand was shaking. You looked around the temple. The mist had started to clear, and rays of pale light stretched across the wooden floor like fingers trying to reach something long forgotten. You weren't sure how long you sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, you rose and stepped outside. The mountain air was sharp and clean. Every breath felt like it belonged to a different life. You walked through the overgrown courtyard, past the half-buried stones, the weathered statues. There were footsteps in the soil, yours, and maybe another's. And as you passed beneath the old torii gate, you whispered his name aloud. Tamo. The wind stirred. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe it was recognition. You didn't head back down the mountain. Not yet. You followed the path behind the temple, barely visible now under weeds and fallen branches. You didn't know where it led, but something inside you did. The old path curved downward. Swallowed by time, you moved carefully, watching each step. Moss coated the stones. Bamboo bent low overhead. Every now and then, you'd brush aside a branch and reveal just a little more sky. The forest was alive with sound, crickets in the house. Brush, wind sighing in the treetops, water whispering somewhere nearby. You didn't know where you were going, but your hand still held the scroll, and your heart. It had already left the present behind. There was a third letter tucked in the box. Smaller, lighter, the paper smelled faintly of plum blossoms. You didn't wait until you found a better place to sit. You opened it beneath a cedar tree, and his voice returned. When I think of peace, I think of the dragonflies. I was a child, barefoot and wild, chasing them through the rice fields just after the morning rains. They used to gather near the stream at the edge of our village, little sparks of fire darting through the summer air. My sister and I would count them like stars. I used to believe that the red ones brought luck. She told me the blue ones carried the souls of the dead. We were young, and the world had not yet sharpened its teeth. You smiled faintly. You could almost see them, two barefoot children, racing through the grass with laughter on their lips, arms flailing wildly, as if they could catch time itself in their fingers. Our mother had a quiet laugh. She wore white often, and smelled of warm rice and sandalwood. She sang while she cooked, never quite finishing the melody. My father, by contrast, was all edges. A man of few words and fewer smiles, but his hands were gentle when they held his tools. He carved bows for soldiers who would never know his name. He taught me how to string them without splitting the bamboo. "Precision is kindness," he said once. I didn't understand it. Then, the breeze picked up as you read on. A single dragonfly passed near your face, almost like it hurt him. My favorite days were in early summer, after the storms, when the world smelled clean and the sky stretched wide and soft. We'd eat by the river. My sister would make boats from leaves. I would watch them drift away and wonder where they ended up. Back then, the only blades I knew were the sickles we used to cut tall grass. The only battles were games between neighbors, and the only armor I wore was the mud on my arms. You? Let your eyes close for a moment. It was hard to imagine the man who wrote the first two letters as that boy. But maybe that was the point. Before the blood, before the loss, he had been whole once, like all of us. There was a woman in our village. Old, hunched, blind in one eye, we called her Oba-chan. Though she wasn't our grandmother, she told us stories in the evenings when the fireflies began to rise. Ghost stories, love stories, stories of mountains that walked in rivers that remembered your name. I loved them, not because I believed them, but because she did. The world has ears, she used to say. Be careful what you say aloud. The wind repeats things it likes. You looked around. The wind was moving again. Maybe it remembered this too. I was 10 when the men in black armor came. They didn't speak, just walked through our village. Like we were real, they didn't burn anything, didn't steal, they just looked. And that was worse. After that, my father stopped smiling entirely. He sat me down one morning and said, "Tomo, the world is changing. You will not have the life I had." He handed me a stick and told me to stand like the guards we'd seen. My mother protested quietly, but she didn't stop him. It was the first time I held something like a sword. It felt heavy, even though it wasn't real. You imagined it clearly now, a boy barely taller than the doorway, holding a carved stick with both hands, knees bent too far, eyes serious. I hated it at first. The form, the repetition, the endless silence. But there was something inside me that wanted to understand. Not the killing, not the fighting. The stillness. My sister would tease me for hours afterward. Call me Little Hawk, because I tried to stand like the statue of our clan's bird. She'd throw pebbles at me to test my reflexes. Most of the time, she hit me square in the chest. But I didn't mind. You felt warmth in your throat as you read that part. A sibling bond, playful, real, untouched by war. You wondered how long it had lasted. There was one afternoon I still dream about. The rain had stopped just after midday. Everything shimmered. Steam rose from the stones. My sister and I ran through the backfields, chasing dragonflies. She caught one, held it gently. It didn't even try to fly away. She looked at me and said, "Maybe it knows who we are." I laughed. I don't laugh much anymore, but I did then. She handed it to me, like a gift. And I remember holding that dragonfly for what felt like forever, watching its wings twitch, seeing my reflection in its eyes. That was the last day I ever held one. A deep silence followed on the page. There were more words, but they came slower now, as if written years later, as if it hurt to write them. My sister died in the third fire. No one found her body, but I remember the way the house collapsed. I remember her voice, yelling for us to run. I remember my mother's hands pulling me away. I remember the sound my father made. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of something breaking that can never be rebuilt. You lowered the scroll. Your throat was dry. He didn't need to describe it in detail. You could feel the ashes on your skin. You could hear the silence that followed a scream too late to matter. You gently rolled the paper back up and placed it into the box. Then you sat beneath the cedar tree for a long time. A dragonfly passed again. You didn't reach for it. You let it fly. And somewhere far beyond the mist, the wind remembered the name of a girl who used to laugh like rain. The mountain path led deeper into the woods. You didn't stop walking. Even when the sun began to fade, the box felt heavier in your hands, though you knew it wasn't weight that made your arms ache. It was memory, not your own but his, layered, bleeding into your thoughts like a slow rainfall. You didn't know if it was real anymore. The difference between his life and yours was blurring, and maybe that was the point. Eventually, the trees thinned, and you came across an old shrine half swallowed by moss. A broken stone lantern leaned sideways. As if bowing, you sat on its base, unwrapped the next scroll, and let the silence close in around you. And then his voice again. I first met Lord Hanzo when I was 16. It was not a battlefield, not a palace. It was a market. I was carrying a bag of rice for a merchant. My clothes were torn, my hands blistered. I hadn't eaten that morning, and the weight of the bag made my knees ache. A man stepped in front of me and asked, "Do you know why a full rice bag is harder to carry than an empty one?" I thought he was mad. Just another noble looking to shame a farmer's son. I didn't answer. He nodded like that was enough and walked away. It wasn't until I returned to the merchant's stall that I realized who he was. Lord Hanzo, the daimyo of the Eastern Wind. You paused. That name again. It had echoed through every letter so far, quietly, with reverence, not just a lord, something more. I expected punishment, maybe a fine, maybe a beating, but when I saw him again that night, he remembered me. Still carrying bags? He asked. I said nothing. Then he said, "Come to my compound tomorrow. If you're going to carry something heavy, it may as well be a sword." You imagined it, Tomo, sunburned and suspicious, standing in silence while a nobleman with a quiet voice offered him the first thread of a future he never asked for. I didn't go. Not the next day, not the day after. It was my mother who convinced me. She said the wind does not knock twice. She was right. I arrived on the third morning. I expected drills, barked orders. I expected to be broken and rebuilt, like soldiers were in stories. But there were no banners, no yelling, just a courtyard, a garden, men sitting in meditation, no armor, no swords. The first thing Hanzo said to me was, "Put your blade away. You haven't earned the silence it requires." You let the words sink into your chest. There was something in that sentence that didn't let go. Most lords collect warriors like coins. They praise skill, reward cruelty. Hanzo didn't care how well I could fight. He only cared how long I could listen. Every morning, I swept the walkway from the gate to the tea house, 30 stones. He told me to memorize each one, their color, their shape, their sound under my sandals. I thought it was punishment. Years later, on the eve of battle, I realized it was prayer. The page had a slight smear across it, like a drop of water had fallen there and dried, or maybe a tear. Hanzo didn't raise his voice often. When he did, it wasn't anger. It was grief. He taught that the sword should be used no more than a tea ladle. Deliberate, quiet, held with purpose, not pride. One morning, he asked me to serve tea. I spilled it. He smiled. "Good," he said. "If you spilled blood the same way, I'd have to kill you." You smiled too. You could see him, young, frustrated, bowing awkwardly, while an older man found laughter in his failure. I trained under him for 5 years. He taught me to move before I thought, to listen before I answered, to breathe like the earth does, slow, deep, patient. He told me a warrior was not someone who wins, but someone who continues. When I asked him what I would fight for, he said, "You'll know when you're finished fighting." You glanced at the trees. The wind was beginning to move again, low and steady. It felt like an answer. I watched him lead men into battle and still return home to water his garden. I watched him pray over the names of those he killed. I watched him bury a boy who died from his first mistake, and then tend the tree that grew near the boy's grave for the next 10 years. Honor was not something he wore. It was something he cultivated. The sky overhead was beginning to shift, blue fading to gold. You could hear birds starting to settle in the trees. And Tamo's words continued. Hanzo was not perfect, but he was true. When my mother died, he sat beside me in silence for 3 hours. Not a word, not a hand on my shoulder, just presence. I've never been able to repay that. He told me once that when the final wind comes, we will not be judged for our victories or our failures, only for how we held our blade in the moments between. You held the scroll a little tighter. There was so much gentleness in it, not weakness, not passivity, but a stillness earned from pain. The kind of peace only a man who's bled for it can teach. I once asked him if he was afraid to die. He said, "Not anymore. I am only afraid of dying without having taught enough." You lowered the scroll and closed your eyes for a moment. And somehow, it felt like the wind just for a moment bowed its head. The trail narrowed the farther you walked. Roots pushed through the soil like ribs. The forest air was darker, thicker. You could feel the hush of it, the kind of silence that doesn't just happen on its own. It's held, as if the trees are listening. You stepped carefully. Something about this stretch of woods felt older, not just in years, but in memory. You wondered if this was one of the places he walked, one of the places where the past still lingers, long after feet have stopped passing through. You reached a clearing at last, no bigger than a courtyard, ringed with tall pines and worn stones. It felt right. You sat down on one of them, and with hands steady and slow, you opened the next letter. The paper crackled softly, like dried leaves. His ink had changed, slightly darker now, more deliberate, and the first line cut deep. There is a moment in every warrior's life when the sword no longer feels like wood or steel, but like your own breath. I remember mine. I was 17. It was spring. The peach trees were beginning to bloom outside Hanzo's southern gate. The wind was soft, the air sweet, and I was about to kill a man. You felt it before you understood it, a tightening in your chest, a knot slowly forming as his words continued. It wasn't war, not yet. It was punishment. A local bandit had been caught robbing a merchant convoy on the river path. 2 men killed, 1 woman wounded. They brought him to the courtyard. His hands were bound with rope, his face calm, not ashamed, not afraid, just quiet. Hanzo said nothing, just handed me a sword, not the one I trained with, not the bamboo blade, a real one, heavy, cold, clean. He looked at me and said, "You have trained your form? Now see if your soul can hold it." You could see him there in your mind, Tamo, young and untested, standing barefoot on smooth stone, the sunlight warm on his neck, the steel in his hand trembling not from weight, but from what it meant. The man knelt before me. He didn't speak, didn't plead. I wanted him to run. I wanted him to scream, to spit at me, to do anything that would make this feel justified. But he just knelt. I raised the blade. I had practiced this cut 1,000 times. The diagonal arc, the shift in the hips, the follow-through. My arms knew it. My body knew it. But my heart did not. I hesitated. It felt like your own breath caught. You were there now, somehow, shoulders tense, sword raised, waiting for something, anything to tell you this was right. Hanzo did not stop me. No one did. I could hear the breeze in the peach trees, the distant chatter of birds, the whisper of my own breath. And I struck. The blade trembled. It landed clean, too clean, the way it's supposed to, if done properly. But I didn't feel pride. I didn't feel justice. Felt the earth tilt. I looked down at my hands, and they were steady, too steady, as if they had done something they'd always known how to do. Even if I didn't, I sheathed the blade, I bowed, I turned away. You realized you were holding your own hands tightly. You loosened them. There was more on the scroll, but the ink grew lighter now, softer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sat in the garden, watching the moon, listening to the wind through the paper walls. Hanzo joined me. He didn't ask questions, just poured tea. I finally said, "It didn't feel right." He nodded. "That's the only proof I needed that you were ready." You read that line again and again, not because you didn't understand it, but because you did, and it ached. The sword should always tremble, he told me. If it ever grows still in your hands, you have become something dangerous. You looked around the clearing, the pine needles beneath your feet, the soft scent of old bark, and the faint breeze weaving through the branches above. From that day forward, I carried the blade like a burden, not out of shame, but out of reverence. Each time I drew it, I remembered the man in the courtyard, the way he knelt, the way he looked at me like I was already his end. He gave me more than his life. He gave me my code, you. Closed the scroll gently. The clearing felt different now, as if something invisible had stepped into it beside you. A presence, not of fear, but of humility. You placed the scroll back into the box, rose slowly, and bowed to the space in front of you. And when you turned to leave the clearing, the wind picked up again, soft, carrying peach blossoms that shouldn't be here this time of year, but were. The sky was beginning to darken by the time you reached the edge of the forest. You hadn't meant to walk so far, but something in your legs wouldn't stop, as if the words you'd read kept pushing you forward. You followed the slope of the land until you reached a ridge where the trees fell away and the world opened wide. Below, in the quiet distance, valleys stretched like sleeping dragons. Rivers wound through the land like silver threads, and on. One distant hill, just barely visible, you thought you saw the faded outline of a watchtower, or maybe just a ruin. It was hard to tell, but you stayed there a while, watching, breathing, letting the quiet settle around you again. When you finally unrolled the next scroll, the paper felt heavier than before, as if the story within it carried the weight of many ghosts. I was 18 when I marched beneath a banner for the first time. It was red, faded at the edges, no crest, no clan symbol, just color. Hanzo believed a banner should not tell others who you are, but why you are here. Our reason was peace, but peace, in our case, had to be earned in blood. You could hear it already in your mind, the crunch of sandals on gravel, the clang of steel, the hush before the storm. We left at sunrise. No speeches, no music, just footsteps. Quiet, measured. I carried my sword low, hidden beneath my robe, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want it to feel like a threat. We moved through rice fields and silent towns. People bowed as we passed, not in reverence, but in fear. They had seen banners before, and they knew what followed. I tried to meet their eyes, to show them I was not like the others, that I didn't come to burn or steal or punish. But they didn't look back. You felt it like trying to shout through water, the weight of being a weapon in a world too tired to hope you're different. Our target was a hilltop fortress, held by a rival warlord who had rejected Hanzo's offer of alliance. There had been skirmishes, raids, 3 border villages lost in smoke. Hanzo wanted it over quickly, cleanly, but war doesn't listen to intentions. There was no grand battle, no horns, just an ambush on a narrow trail. Arrows from the trees, screams, steel clashing in shadows. It was my first time striking someone who struck back. You held the scroll tighter. I remember the sound of their blade meeting mine, like stone breaking. My arm shook, my stance collapsed. He almost killed me. But I slipped in the mud, fell sideways. His sword missed by inches. I rose without thinking. My training moved through me like breath. The blade found his side before I realized what I'd done. I watched him fall. He looked at me as he bled, and in his eyes, I saw something that made my chest feel hollow. Regret. He wasn't a monster, just another boy like me. Just on the wrong side of a river. You looked out over the valley again. It all seemed so still now, but beneath every ridge, every stone, there had been stories like this. Silent, buried, waiting. The fortress didn't last the day. We stormed it before dusk. The defenders were outnumbered. Some surrendered, some did not. By nightfall, the flames had risen. I stood beneath our banner-soaked, shivering, my sword dripping with rain and more than rain. I looked up at that red cloth, watched it sway above me, and I felt nothing. You blinked. You hadn't expected that. I wanted to feel pride or sorrow or rage, but there was only stillness. And that's when I understood. The battlefield is not a place where honor lives. It is a place where we remember honor, where we cling to it like a lantern in the dark. That night, Hanzo found me in the corner of the courtyard, staring at a crack in the stone. He didn't speak. He just placed something beside me, a cup of warm sake. Then he sat. We drank in silence. I asked him, did I do the right thing? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, you asked the question. That's enough. You imagine them there, two men with blood on their clothes, smoke in their lungs, and silence between them, holding on to the only thing that hadn't been burned yet, a shared understanding. Before dawn, we buried the dead, both sides. We used the broken spears as markers, the enemy's as well as ours. Hanzo believed no man's death was lesser. You found yourself wiping dust from the edge of the scroll, like it mattered, like even your fingers needed to show respect. I began to write names in my journal after that. Names of men I fought, names of those I couldn't save, names I never learned. Some I made up, just to give them something other than emptiness. I still remember the first one I wrote, Hoshino. I don't know if that was his name, but I wanted to believe he had someone who once whispered it with love. You breathed in slow. There was something about that line, something that made you feel heavier. And lighter? All at once, we left the fortress with no songs, no spoils, no boasts, only silence. And the wind, you looked up. The trees around you had gone still. Even the birds had quieted. And then just barely, you felt it. A breeze, gentle, carrying the smell of smoke that wasn't there. You closed the scroll and didn't speak for a while. Somewhere far away, a banner still swayed. Even if it couldn't be seen, the hills rose like sleeping giants, their backs curved with age, covered in long grass. Speckled with stones, silent you walked slowly now, not because your body ached, but because something inside of you had changed. The scrolls you carried weren't just ink and memory anymore. They were part of you, woven into the way you breathed, the way you looked at the trees, the way you walked past places that felt heavier than they should. That morning, the sky had opened early, washed with pale light and low clouds. The wind was still again, not absent. Just watching, you reached a small rise where the earth sloped downward into a shallow valley. The grass here was shorter, the dirt more visible, and when you knelt down and touched it with your fingers, it came away, red, not blood, just soil. Iron-rich, old, but it looked the same, and somehow, you knew you were in the right place. You opened the next scroll. I returned to the Red Hills 3 years after the battle. The trees had started to grow back. The charred stumps were covered in moss, and the old trench lines had mostly collapsed, but the ground still held the memory. It's strange how the earth keeps what we tried to forget. You looked around. Nothing in sight except for wind-brushed grass and scattered stone. But you believed him. There had been no victory songs after the campaign, only a slow march home. Fewer men than before, tired, changed. Hanzo did not speak during the return. I don't think he slept either. Men spoke his name with pride, called him a hawk, a wind ghost, a war mine. He hated that. He told me the more a man is praised for his skill in killing, the more he must learn to grieve in. Silence. You sat with that sentence in your chest, like a rock in water, when we returned. I found my journal again. The one with the names. I couldn't add more. I tried. But the names had become too many. Too blurred. Some I remembered by their eyes. Some by the way they fell. Some by the way they didn't fall, but watched someone else die instead. I realized then that war doesn't end when the swords are sheathed. It continues, in the silence, in the dreams, in the way you flinch at sudden sounds. Even when you are home, you looked out at the hills, the wind shifted slightly, and in your mind, you could almost hear the sound of distant hooves. Or maybe it was just the breeze brushing stone. I returned to the red hills alone. I didn't tell anyone. I just went. I brought incense, water, stones I had carved with the names I could still remember. I placed them one by one into the soil, no order, no shrine, just stones in the earth. Then I knelt. For hours, you could feel him doing it now, somehow, as if, in some part of the world, he was still there kneeling in the dirt, not praying, not asking forgiveness, just being present. There were bones beneath the soil. I could feel them, not from my side, not just from theirs, just bones, just silence. It's a strange thing, knowing the land you stand on remembers everything you did. I didn't weep. I didn't say words. I just listened. A pause in the writing. The breeze passed over the ridge again, soft, low, like breath. I stayed until the sun began to fall. The hills turned red again, not from blood, but from the light, as if the sky itself remembered the fire. And before I left, I made a promise. I whispered it into the soil, where only the dead could hear. I will not let your names vanish. I will not pretend. This was glory. I will carry you. You swallowed hard. I returned to Hanzo's compound that night. He was sitting beneath the plum tree, the same one I'd trained under when I first arrived. He looked at me, and I knew without words that he understood where I had gone. Did they forgive you? He asked. I didn't answer, because I didn't know. You closed your eyes. The sound of the scroll was still there, but your mind had drifted to other hills, other valleys, other wars that weren't yours, but felt close anyway. And when you opened them again, the wind had shifted direction, carrying not just air, but presence. The final line of the scroll was shorter, softer, like it had been written in a whisper. Some soil never forgets, but sometimes it forgives. You let the scroll rest across your knees. The earth beneath you was warm, and for a brief moment, you felt as though every name lost in the hills had risen up not to haunt you, but to walk with you. Silent, gentle, forgiven, you didn't walk much that morning. Your legs were sore, not from distance, but from something deeper, like you'd been walking through memories heavier than miles. So you sat by a narrow stream. The water barely moved, just enough to carry fallen petals along its mirrored surface. You dipped your fingers into the current. It was cold, clear, and strangely still, as if the river had forgotten how to run fast. And as you unrolled the next scroll, the silence around you thickened. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of after. The war didn't end when we won. It didn't end when we lost. It ended when there was no one left to fight. You paused, let those words echo, then you read on. I was 22. My armor no longer shone. My robes were no longer white. The red banner we carried was torn, patched, re-dyed again and again, until it no longer resembled anything but a wound fluttering in the wind. The last campaign came without warning. A border skirmish turned into a siege turned into an invasion, and then nothing. One morning, we woke to birdsong instead of drums. No scouts returned, no enemies attacked. We crept down the hillside with weapons drawn, ready for ambush. There was no one. The fortress below was empty. Food still cooking over low fires, sake cups half drunk, but no voices, no movement, just gone. You could feel it, the eeriness of it all. That wrong stillness, the kind you only hear after something terrible has passed through. We searched room by room. No signs of battle, no signs of surrender, just emptiness. Henzo stood in the middle of the courtyard, his hand resting on his blade, but he didn't draw it. "I left it behind," he said. "Left what?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes sunken, voice soft. The silence. You leaned back against the tree and stared up at the clouds. They drifted slow across the sky. The kind of clouds that don't promise rain or shade, just distance. Scroll continued. We waited 3 days for someone to return. Anyone? No one did. We buried the food, cleaned the fires, burned the bedding. It felt wrong to sleep in a place that still smelled like people. On the 4th day, we rode home. But it didn't feel like a return. It felt like surviving something no one explained. You could hear the hoofbeats in your head, slow, steady, and solemn. Not victory, not retreat, just movement. The village we returned to had changed. No parades, no greetings, just tired faces and shuttered doors. Even the river seemed lower. Hanzo disbanded the company the next day. He said, "Peace has returned, but it came through absence, not understanding." He gave each of us a bag of rice, a short letter of service, and one final lesson. You've spent your youth holding a sword. Now see what you can hold with empty hands. You set the scroll in your lap for a moment. It was a strange thing to imagine war ending not because someone surrendered or died, but because it simply evaporated, like a fever breaking, leaving only sweat and confusion. I wandered after that, north first, then west. I visited old shrines, cleaned grave markers, helped rebuild a village that had lost all its sons. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't tell them. For a while, it felt like I'd disappeared, not from the world, but from myself. There was a note in the brushwork here, softer, the strokes thinner, as if he'd written it on a cold morning. I would wake at dawn, expecting the sound of orders, of clashing wood, of steel on straw. But there was only birdsong. It used to feel foreign. Now it just felt hollow. You reached the end of the scroll and found one final line, written in the corner, like an afterthought or a whisper. Some say peace is the absence of war, but I've seen peace that looks a lot like mourning. You sat with that, not in sorrow, not in judgment, just stillness, and the stream moved on beside you, carrying petals that had no idea why they'd fallen, only that the wind had let them go. It had started raining by the time you left the stream. Not hard, just that steady, slow kind of rain that doesn't soak you all at once, but sneaks into your skin, your sleeves, your thoughts. The path turned muddy, and the trees above were dripping in rhythm. Still, you didn't seek shelter. Something about the rain felt honest. You found a stone bench beside a weathered gate. The moss was damp. The wood was cracked, but it felt like the kind of place meant for reading a story someone never meant to say out loud. You unrolled the next scroll, and once again his voice returned, quieter now, but no less sharp. I met her during the monsoon season, not in a temple, not in a town, on the road. I was walking west my 3rd week, without speaking to anyone, but the trees. My robes were wet, my shoes ruined. The path ahead had washed away in the last storm. And then I saw her. You looked up. The rain moved across the trees like fingers through silk. She stood barefoot in the flooded rice field, sleeves rolled, lifting rocks from the mud and stacking them along the levee. Not graceful, not delicate, just steady. I watched for a while without saying a word. When she finally noticed me, she didn't ask where I came from or why I was standing there. She just said, If you're going to watch, you might as well help. You smiled. You could hear her voice in your head already. Calm, dry, no nonsense. I stepped into the water. The mud swallowed my ankles. The rain soaked my sleeves. And for the next hour, we worked in silence. The scroll took on a lighter tone for a few lines. You could feel it, even. In the rhythm of his writing, something had shifted. Something inside him had exhaled. Her name was Aya. She didn't ask mine, not for 3 days. She let me stay in the guest room of the old house near the orchard, site had used to belong to her grandfather before the soldiers came through. She spoke with her hands, worked with her back, and when she laughed, it sounded like a small bell ringing under a waterfall. She didn't ask about the sword I kept near my bed. She just placed a wooden bowl of rice beside me every evening and said, "Eat." You could feel it. Now, not love at first. Sight. Not romance, just presence. And maybe that was rarer. I helped her dig irrigation trenches, stack firewood, fix a broken fence that no one else had bothered to touch in years. She never asked what I had done. Never. Asked why I winced at sudden noises. Why I didn't look people in the eye. She just let me be. And in return, I began to remember how to be someone who wasn't a warrior. You closed your eyes for a second. The rain had started to wash the dirt from the edge of your boots. The scroll continued, the ink slightly smudged, as if he'd written some of it while it was raining or crying or both. One night, thunder shook the walls. I woke with my hand on the hilt. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just walked over to me, sat beside the bed, and placed her hand over mine. I hadn't been touched like that in years. Not by a lover, not by a friend, but by someone who saw me, not what I had done, not what I had become, just me. You read that line 3 times before moving on. I asked her once if she hated men like me, soldiers, ghosts of war. Looked out the window and said, "The war ended, but the land still needs hands." You have hands. You exhaled. That was it, wasn't it? The most human truth of all. You have hands. What will you use them for now? I stayed through the rains, through the planting season, through the first frost. I fixed the roof, painted the gate, wrote names in my journal, and buried the book beneath a plum tree. She never read the letters. She didn't need to. You reached the end of the scroll and found a sentence that didn't sound like a conclusion, but a prayer. She didn't save me. She reminded me I was still worth saving. You stared out at the rain, and for a moment, you thought you saw her too, a woman in a field, lifting stones from the mud, sleeves rolled, not looking back, not needing to. The rain had stopped by the time you reached the ridge. Mist clung to the treetops like fading smoke, and every step felt muffled. You moved without thought now. The scrolls no longer felt like stories. They felt like memories, yours, his, maybe. Both. You paused beneath a leaning pine tree, where the earth dipped into a shallow hollow. The wind stirred again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of charred wood, though there was no fire in sight. And in that moment, you knew. The next scroll would not be peaceful. You unrolled it slowly, bracing yourself. And there he was again, his voice quiet at first, like someone recalling a dream he never wanted to remember. It came on a morning when the rice was nearly ready for harvest. Aya had gone to the orchard. I was sharpening a spade, not a blade, when I saw them. 3 riders, no armor, no noise, just dust behind their sandals and something cold in their eyes. They didn't ask for food. They asked for me by name. You could feel it in your chest already, that shift. The twist in the gut when a past you buried starts clawing its way back through the soil. The scroll they handed me was sealed with lacquered black twine. Not Hanzo's seal, not the clan I had served. A new banner, new war. He didn't describe the letter's contents in detail, but he didn't have to. You already knew what it meant. A northern warlord had seized the border towns. Not with armies, with whispers, assassinations, bribes, promises. Hanzo was gone by then, dead 2 winters, his name preserved only in ink and memory. Now a new lord ruled in his place. Lord Kantaka. They said he wanted men who remembered how to hold steel, who had survived fire. Men like me. You gripped the scroll tighter, your mouth dry. I told them I was no longer a warrior. They smiled. The sword remembers, one of them said, even if your hands forget. I didn't answer. They left me a red ribbon, tied it to the branch outside the orchard gate. A red ribbon, the kind that binds hair or banners or ghosts. Aya found me that night in the tool shed, staring at my old armor. She didn't speak, just sat beside me on the floor, her legs folded, hands in her lap. Finally, I asked, if I go, will you wait? She didn't look at me. She said, if you leave, it means you never truly arrived. You let that sink in, not cruel, not cold, just true. She was right. I had been walking between worlds, 1 foot in war, 1 foot in soil, pretending that the mud on my boots was enough to bury the blood on my hands. But I wanted to believe there was a middle place, somewhere, between the man who knelt in rain to plant plum trees and the one who once ended a life without blinking. The scroll grew heavier now, the ink bolder. I left the next morning, not with the soldiers, alone, no sword, no armor, just the red ribbon in my sleeve and the weight of 1,000 unsaid goodbyes. Aya didn't come. To the gate. She didn't have to. You took a deep breath. You didn't judge him, because you understood it now. Leaving was not the same as forgetting, and returning to the sword didn't mean he stopped being the man she saw. It just meant that something out there had called to him loud enough that silence couldn't hold him anymore. I followed the river north, through the ravine where Hanzo once trained us, past the trees that still bore burned scars from the Red Hills fires. I saw old comrades sharpening their blades, new recruits barely able to hold theirs. War had changed, but not ended. He paused there, then a line that felt like thunder under your ribs. I was not afraid of dying. I was afraid of forgetting why I chose to live. You folded the scroll slowly. It didn't end with triumph, or fire, or a final battle cry. Just that single truth, soft, steady. And as you sat beneath the pine, you realized he had not returned to war because he wanted to fight. He returned because some battles follow you, whether you answer the call or not. You followed the river that morning, not because it was the easiest path, but because something about water always felt honest. It doesn't lie, doesn't argue, just moves forward, carving through mountains if it must. Breaking stone with patience alone. The mist hadn't lifted yet, and your footsteps left little sound. You found a small shrine by the riverbend half broken, the roof slanted, moss crowding the base. You sat beside it, no offerings, no incense. Just the sound of the stream and the hum of birdsong threading through trees. And then, the next scroll, the paper was thinner now, almost brittle, but the ink was steady, still sharp, still his voice. I arrived at the southern garrison, just before nightfall. The men there barely remembered me. A few recognized the style of my walk, the calluses on my hands. One even bowed and said, I heard you once faced 5 in the Orchard Valley. Alone. I didn't correct him. I wasn't there for legend. You pictured him standing at the camp gates, older, leaner, his robe plain, no sword at his hip, and in a place where every man wore steel like skin. That made him dangerous in a different way. They asked where my blade was. I told them I had left it behind. They laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, just the way men laugh when they can't understand a thing. The commander wasn't amused. He said, this is no place for monks. I said, then stop acting like this is a temple. He didn't laugh. You smiled despite yourself. Tomo had never been loud, but he didn't need to be. His stillness carried more weight than most men's roars. The next day, the skirmish began. Smoke over the hills, drums in the distance, the scent of pine crushed under boots. I stood on the ridge, beside the banner. They handed me a blade. I refused. The young archer beside me looked confused. "How will you defend yourself?" he asked. I said, "By reminding them I don't need to die to prove I lived." You paused. That sentence hit like the sudden drop of silence after a thunderclap. The fighting was brutal. Screams, mud, steel singing its cruel song. I walked among them, not charging, not striking. I pulled men from the muck, bandaged limbs, stopped a bleeding throat with my bare hands. No one could believe I wasn't harmed. One soldier from the other side tried to strike me. I looked him in the eyes, said nothing. He froze, dropped his sword, walked away. You exhaled. There's power in a man who chooses not to kill, sometimes more than in the one who does. That night, the camp was quiet. No victory, no loss, just exhaustion. Men stared at me like I was made of something unfamiliar. Not heroism, not madness, but memory. Like I reminded them of something they weren't sure they ever believed in. You read on, slower now, not because it was hard to follow, but because you didn't want it to end too soon. I spoke to the wounded, heard their names, asked about their sisters, their sons, their favorite flowers. One man said, "I don't remember the last time someone asked me something that wasn't about a kill." I told him, "Then remember this instead. You set the scroll in your lap for a moment, because how could someone write something so heavy and so gentle in the same sentence?" On the third day, the enemy sent a messenger. White flag, clean robe, mud to the knees. He asked to speak with our commander. I intercepted. He asked me, "Are you the one who walks with no weapon?" I nodded. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because peace doesn't need to be louder than war. It just needs to endure longer." You swallowed. That line stayed heavy, honest, hopeful. The next dawn, the other side retreated. No blood spilled, no terms spoken, just silence. Some say it was strategy, others say fear. But I know why. They saw someone walk through fire and not burn. They saw a man who had killed, choose not to. And it reminded them what it means to stop. You didn't move for a while after reading that. The sound of the river felt deeper now, like it carried those words downstream toward someone else who might need them. I didn't stay long. I left before the commander could pin a ribbon on my chest. No medals, no titles. I returned to the orchard. Aya didn't speak. She just handed me the spade again. And I went back to digging. You smiled because of course she did. Of course he did. The path behind you had turned golden. Autumn had crept in without permission. Leaves swirled around your feet, dry and whispering. The light between the trees had taken on that warm, dying glow, the kind that softens everything it touches, even old bones and older regrets. You found a wide rock by a twisted maple, and sat without thinking. Your hands moved gently now as you unrolled the next scroll. Careful not to tear the edges. The ink was thinner here, the lines more spaced out, the handwriting a little slower. He was aging, you could feel it, and so were his memories. The orchard changed slowly. First, the roof tiles on the old house began to crack. Then the peach tree stopped blooming early. Then Aya's fingers began to ache in the cold. And mine did too. You sat back against the trunk and let the silence speak for a moment. You knew where this was going, but still you wanted to walk beside him, even if it hurt. I turned 50 before I realized I'd stopped looking behind me, stopped waiting for the sound of hooves or banners on the hill. The sword stayed buried in the chest under the floorboards. Sometimes I would open it just to see it. It didn't shine like it used to. There was rust at the edge, but the handle still fit in my hand, like it had been waiting. He didn't say whether he lifted it, and maybe that was the point. The world outside didn't need men like me anymore. New lords, new banners, new rules written on scrolls no one reads. I once passed through a village and saw a statue of Hanzo, but they'd carved his face wrong. They gave him a snarl, a war-hardened glare. I wanted to tell them he smiled more than he fought, but I didn't. I just kept walking. The wind picked up a little, rustling the scroll in your hands. It sounded like breath, like memory. Aya never asked me to stay, but she always made sure I had a reason to come back. A warm meal, a mended robe, a single plum blossom left at my bedside in spring. She aged slower than I did, or maybe she just wore it more gracefully. She still worked the land, with the same stubborn grace. Still scolded me when I forgot to feed the chickens. Still sat in silence beside me when the dreams returned. You smiled at that. It wasn't a romantic story, but it was something more sacred. Shared time, that rare, steady tether between two lives that didn't need to speak in order. To say everything. One winter, I lit the fire too late, and she caught a chill. She didn't complain, just wrapped herself in the thick robe and made tea. But I watched her hands shake. She tried to hide it, like always. You felt your chest tighten. She never spoke of dying, but she did begin giving things away. A comb she'd used for 20 years, passed to a neighbor. Girl, her father's tea bowl, offered to the shrine keeper, even the old prayer bell from her mother's shelf, tied to the gatepost with a string. She said, "If the wind wants to carry me, let it know where I lived." You paused. Let that line sit in your chest. It ached, beautifully. She left in spring, just before the plum trees bloomed. I found her outside, sitting beneath the orchard's oldest branch. She looked like she'd simply fallen asleep. I didn't weep right away. Just held her hand and whispered the names of every tree we'd planted together. One for each season we'd survived. You looked out at the path before you. It shimmered with gold, with leaves, with years. I burned her robe beneath the stars, tied the ashes in rice paper, and gave them to the river. I didn't say goodbye, because she's never really left. There was a smudge of ink across the next line. A pause, maybe a hesitation, or maybe a hand that trembled just a little. The orchard kept growing, even as my hands forgot how to hold a trowel, even as the wind grew colder in my lungs. I stopped speaking most days, started writing again. Not for glory, not for history, just for someone. Someone I haven't met, or maybe someone I've always known. You felt your breath catch, as if maybe he had written these words, not just for anyone, but for you. I do not regret the sword. I do not worship it either. I do not regret the war, but I refuse to lie and say it made me wise. What taught me the most was planting something, watching it grow, and learning to stay when nothing demanded I leave. You closed the scroll slowly. There were more, but you needed a moment. The leaves above stirred gently, and the old bell he spoke of, wherever it now hung, seemed to echo in the back of your mind, a soft chime, like a whisper tied to the wind. The trees thinned out as you climbed the next ridge. The golden hues of autumn gave way to rock and lichen, and the wind had a sharper bite now. The air smelled like pine bark, and distance like the scent of a place forgotten by maps, but remembered by memory. You found a flat slab of stone, and sat there, legs crossed, scrolls in your lap. The mountain below stretched endlessly. But your attention wasn't on the view. It was on the soft parchment in your hands. The next scroll was unlike the others, its edges uneven, its brush strokes more uneven still. It was clear even before you read a single line. This was not written for others. It was written to no one, or maybe to everyone. You began to read. I never believed in diaries, but I did write letters to men who died before I could speak to them, to comrades who never asked for their stories to be told, to my mother, whose voice I can no longer remember, to Aya, even after she was gone, and once, to a boy who never existed, You slowed already. This scroll felt different, like a whisper from a soul laid bare. They're buried in the orchard, all of them, tied with old silk, stacked in a jar, beneath the roots of the youngest plum tree. No one will read them, but I needed to write them. You imagined him sitting beneath the tree, candlelight flickering, fingers stiff with age, brush trembling slightly, not from fear, but from honesty, to Masaru, the archer who died with my name on his lips. I still remember your laugh, that crooked tooth, the way you always tied your sandals too tight. I should have carried your body home. I didn't. I ran. I survived. I'm sorry. A pause. Next part was lighter, and somehow heavier. To my mother. I don't know what color your hair was. I forget the sound of your lullabies. But I remember your hands, one scar across the knuckle, always warm, even in winter. I hope I made you proud, not for the wars, but for learning how to grow something. You felt that, right between the ribs. To Aya, I never told you this, but the day you touched my sword and said nothing was the day I began to believe in tomorrow. You gave me years I didn't deserve. You let me be quiet, and in that silence, I found everything I thought I lost. If I see you again, I will bring you a handful of plum blossoms, and I will sit beside you, like we always did, and I will not speak. The scroll's ink faded slightly here, but the emotion didn't. To the son I never had, I would have named you Ren. You would have hated that name, called it old-fashioned. I would have let you change it. I imagined teaching you to hold a rake, not a sword. 2. Speak with your eyes, not your fists. I would have taught you to bow, not just out of respect, but because sometimes we must lower our heads to lift others. If you ever read this, know that your father made mistakes, but he tried, and he never forgot your face, even if it only lived in dreams. You stopped reading, not because the scroll had ended yet, but because your eyes had started to sting, and for a brief moment, it wasn't Tomo's hand holding the brush. It felt like yours. I used to think that warriors carved history with steel, but history forgets steel. It remembers letters, footprints, trees, the way wind moves through an empty house. You reached the final lines. They were written like a poem or a prayer. I leave behind no children, no bloodline, but I leave behind a plum orchard. And if that's all the world remembers of me, that's enough. You didn't roll the scroll back up right away. You let it rest in your lap. Let the silence fill the spaces between each word. Because this chapter wasn't just about death or legacy. It was about honesty and the invisible threads that connect us to people we'll never meet, but somehow always feel. You hadn't seen another soul for hours. The wind had turned colder, and the hills began to flatten into a wide basin rimmed with tall cedar trees. A narrow trail of smoke rose in the distance, thin, slow, deliberate, not the smoke of battle, not a fire out of control, a campfire. You followed it without hesitation. The clearing opened slowly, and when you reached the edge, you paused. There were 4 of them, old men, one missing an eye, another with a hunched back, a third sharpening a small blade, not because he needed to, just because his hands didn't know what else to do. The 4th simply stared at the flames, as if trying to remember how light used to dance on steel. And among them sat Tomo, or what remained of him. I didn't expect to see them again. The scroll in your hand was dated differently than the others. Newer, neater. His handwriting more fragile, but every stroke held its breath. We hadn't spoken in decades. No summons brought us, no war, no death, just time. Time and the ache to see who else had endured. You sat on a stone, just beyond the clearing, as if part of the circle. A silent observer to a moment never meant to be recorded, yet here it was. Wrapped in ink, we called each other by names we hadn't used since we were boys. Rabbit for the one who always ran faster than the rest. Stone for the one who never cried. even when his brother died in his arms. Flame, the one who sang before battle and screamed afterward, and me? They still called me Ghost. You smiled, it fit. We didn't talk about who we'd killed. No need, the fire already knew. You could see it. 4 tired warriors, faces lit orange, hands wrapped around warm cups' shoulders. No longer armored, but still heavy with years. Stone spoke first. He said, "Do you ever dream of the faces?" We all nodded. No one answered. You swallowed, because that? You understood. Rabbit said he sometimes sees the boy he once was, hiding behind trees in his sleep. He wakes up and apologizes aloud, just in case the boy's still listening. Flame laughed and said, "I talk to ghosts more than I talk to people these days." Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you still write those letters?" I said, "Yes." He nodded and said, "I burned all mine." A pause in the ink then. I didn't judge him. I understood. Some wounds don't want to be kept. They want to be let go. The fire popped in your mind. You could see the sparks rise up like tiny prayers. We spoke until the moon was high. Not like warriors, like men. The next few lines were softer, as if he had written them slowly, deliberately. They spoke of wives who had waited, of children who never came, of hands that shook when pouring tea, of things they never said out loud to their fathers, or sons, or even themselves. You looked up from the scroll. There were no trees like that around you now, no fire, but the words warmed the air just the same. At one point, Flame stood and asked us to bow our heads. No prayers, no rituals, just silence. 1 minute for every man we could still remember. We bowed for a long time. You closed your eyes, and bowed too, just for a moment. When we lifted our heads, Rabbit had tears running down his cheeks. Stone placed a hand on his back. No words, just presence. There's a kind of strength in that being together without needing to explain. Just being. They asked me to speak last. Not because I was wise, but because they thought I had found peace. You could almost hear his voice in your ears now. Older, slower, but steady. I told them I hadn't found peace. Found time. Time to unlearn what the war taught me. Time to grow things instead of burn them. Time to love without needing to protect. And sometimes, time to remember without drowning. You let out a shaky breath. You weren't sure when your hands had started trembling. They left before dawn. No goodbyes. No promises to meet again. Just a nod, a glance, and footsteps that disappeared into the morning fog. You rolled the scroll closed. But one last line stood at the very bottom, written sideways, like it had been added after the fire burned out. Not all warriors die in battle. Some live long enough to forgive themselves. You stayed by the invisible firelight long after. That even though the fire was never yours, because now somehow it was. By now, the sun had begun to set behind the hills, and the sky was painted in hues of faded crimson and soft gold. The air had cooled. Your breath came out in faint clouds. You pulled your cloak tighter, but the chill didn't reach your bones. You felt something else stirring now. Not cold, but closure. You set your pack down and opened the next scroll, and almost immediately, you knew this would not be about battle. This would be about what comes after. I dug it up on the first day of the last winter. The earth above the floorboards had hardened with frost, but I knew where it was. My hands found the shape of the wood before my eyes did. The box had aged. The silk wrap around the hilt had faded from deep black to dusty gray. I sat with it on my lap for a long time. I didn't open it, not at first. You could see it clearly in your mind. Tomo kneeling alone in the small house, firelight flickering across his weathered face, hands resting on a blade that hadn't tasted daylight in decades. I didn't open it to fight. I opened it to see. You exhaled slowly, because that was the kind of line that lingered. I removed the blade from its sheath. The metal had dulled, a line. of rust ran just beneath the guard. I didn't clean it. I didn't polish it. I just held it. I held it the way a man might hold a letter from someone long gone, carefully, like it might break if you breathed too hard. The scroll grew more sparse now, more thoughtful, as though every word cost him something I remembered. The first time I held it, hands trembling, heart full of fire, mind full of names I thought I needed to honor through blood. And I remembered the last time. Hands steady, heart quiet, no names, no rage, only silence. You realized something in that moment. The sword wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a mirror. I thought about melting it down, turning it into a plow, or a chisel, or burying it once more, deeper this time, so no hand could find it again. But then I thought, what if it simply needs to rest? You read slower now, every line like the slow fading of an echo. So I placed it beside the hearth, no longer hidden, no longer feared, just present, like an old dog who no longer hunts, but still sleeps at the door. There was something sacred in that image, a blade no longer drawn, a life no longer defined by it. Some people say the sword shapes the man. Others say the man shapes the sword. I no longer care which is true. All I know is this: neither is stronger than the choice to set it down. You folded the scroll across your knees and looked out at the darkening horizon. There were no enemies on the ridge, no fire rising behind you, no banners waiting. Just the soft sound of birds returning to their trees, and that was enough. I am not the blade. I am the hand that let it go. You walked longer than usual today. The trail narrowed into something ancient, barely a trail at all. No, just the suggestion of footsteps worn into the earth by people long gone, grass bowed in the wind. A crow called once and was answered by silence. You could feel the shift, not in the world around you, but in the scroll resting beneath your arm. It didn't hum with the fire of war or the weight of reflection. It simply felt like returning. You stopped beneath a leaning cypress and unrolled the parchment. And once again, you were walking in his footsteps. I hadn't been there in years. The dojo was gone, of course. Only the foundation stones remained square. Outlines covered in moss, weeds growing where we once spilled blood, learning how to hold a wooden blade. I stood at the center, where the bell used to hang, and for the first time in decades, I bowed, not to a master, not to a god, but to the boy I had been. You paused there, that hit something deep. He wasn't mourning the place. He was honoring the self that once stood there. I left behind my training cloth, folded it carefully, placed it on the stone where Master used to sit and watch us. It was stiff from age, frayed at the edges, but it still smelled faintly of cedar oil and sweat. A relic of a life I no longer wore. The next section slowed. You could feel him taking his time now, stopping often, listening. I walked east, down the slope to the river where I first fought my brother. We were children. He struck my nose. I bled. I cried. He didn't mock me. He just offered his sleeve. I never told him thank you. You inhaled softly. Some wounds never reopen. They simply wait. I took a flat stone from the riverbank and carved his name into it with the tip of a rusted nail. I placed it upright in the dirt and whispered, "You would have been a better man than I was. I don't believe in ghosts." But the wind that passed through the reeds that moment felt familiar. You looked up. The wind had picked up around you too, and for a second, it felt like you were not alone. My next step took me to the bamboo grove, the place I hid the day they came for Hanzo. I was 16. I heard the screams from the hill and did not move. Some say that was the day I learned survival. I say it was the day I first felt shame. A beat, one short sentence. I lit incense, knelt there for an hour, and left a single white stone at the base of the tallest stalk. You imagined him rising slowly, knees aching, spine tight, but lighter, maybe a little more air in his lungs than when he knelt. My final stop was the orchard. Not the one Aya and I built. The first one. The place where I killed my first man. He had no name. Just wide eyes and blood that wouldn't stop leaking. I don't even remember what he looked like anymore. But I remember my hand trembling. Not from fear, but because something inside me knew. I'd just left a part of myself behind in the dirt. You could feel the ache in every word now. Not dramatized, not decorated, just real. I planted a seed, not as penance, not as forgiveness, just because it was time to grow something there. You sat with that line for a long time, because it wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about transformation. As I walked home, the light began to shift. The hills looked smaller, my legs heavier, but my shadow looked younger than I remembered. You closed the scroll, hands still. It felt like walking beside someone who had finally made peace, not just with the world, but with his own story. You looked behind you on the trail, not because someone was there, but because part of you wanted someone to be. The frost came early that year, the kind that lingers in the corners of rooftops well into morning, and turns every blade of grass stiff with silence. Even the crows seemed hesitant to call out, as if the cold had pressed its hand gently against the throat of the world. You walked with care, now less out of caution, more out of reverence. The trail had changed, not just its shape, but its feeling. It wasn't leading somewhere anymore. It was becoming something. You stopped near a quiet clearing and pulled out the next scroll. The parchment was thinner than the others, the brush strokes more delicate, sparse, like he'd written it on a day when words were few, but everyone was. Sacred, I woke to snow, thin at first, then thicker. By midday, the orchard wore a white robe, silent, undisturbed. You imagined him stepping out onto the porch, a shawl around his shoulders, his breath rising in slow clouds, the trees around him blanketed in stillness. And then, that's when I saw it, near the center of the orchard, half covered in snow, bent under a low branch, a blossom, pink, soft, alive, a winter bloom, something that should not be there, and yet it was. I knelt beside it, brushed the snow gently away. It didn't flinch. It simply stayed. You could feel what that meant without him saying it outright. Some things don't need explanation. The flower was not just a flower. It was a sign. I don't believe in omens, but I believe in timing. And this felt like the world giving me one last thing to understand. You breathed out slowly, the cold settling deeper now, but the words in the scroll gave warmth. I didn't pick the flower, didn't move it, didn't speak. I just sat there, the snow falling around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't remembering or regretting. I was just being. You paused to take that in, because sometimes that's all we're here to do. Not fix, not change, just exist beside beauty. That night, I wrote a letter, not to anyone, not even to myself, just to life. The ink here changed slightly, smoother, as though he had used a finer brush. This wasn't a scroll anymore. It was a final offering. Dear life, thank you for not turning away when I did. Thank you for giving me seasons, for giving me people who stayed, and even those who left. Thank you for what they taught me. You swallowed hard. It didn't feel like reading anymore. It felt like listening. Thank you for paying. It taught me how to hold gentleness. Thank you for silence. It taught me how to speak without words. Thank you for war. It taught me why peace matters. He didn't try to sound wise. He simply was, in the way that only someone who's lived every corner of life can be. Most of all, thank you for letting me last long enough to see one final bloom, to remind me that not everything obeys the rules, that not every death must be mourned, that some things, quiet, small things, are enough. You wiped at your eye, even if nothing had fallen yet. I will not write again after this, not because there is nothing left to say, but because I finally understand it's okay to let the page remain blank. You rolled the scroll gently, reverently, not because it was fragile, but because you were. A wind passed overhead, and for just a moment, you could almost smell that flower, faint, sweet, and completely out of season. The wind today wasn't cold, it was thin, like the world was exhaling slowly. And you had to listen carefully, just to catch the breath before it vanished. The sun hung lower in the sky, not setting, just hovering. Waiting, you stopped beside an old cedar stump and lowered yourself with care. You were tired, but you weren't sure why. Maybe because the next scroll felt like it already knew how to say goodbye. You unrolled it gently. The paper crackled faintly in your fingers. The strokes were slower now, softer. You could almost hear the brush dragging across parchment like footsteps on warm wood. I dropped the brush today. The sentence was short, almost quiet, and somehow louder than anything before it. My hand didn't tremble. It just stopped. I tried again, holding it differently, like I once did as a boy learning my first characters. But the lines were crooked. The ink puddled at the edge, and I laughed. For the first time in weeks, you smiled. Faintly, because it was such an honest kind of laughter. The kind that comes not from humor, but from the deep relief of finally accepting. My legs fail me sometimes now. Not all at once, just slowly. Like they're deciding to leave before the rest of me does. I don't mind. They've carried me through fire, across rivers, through snow, and into the arms of love. If they want to rest, they've earned it. You closed your eyes for a moment. It was strange how calm it made you feel. This wasn't a chapter of sadness. It was permission. I no longer tend the orchard. Not because I don't want to, because I trust it will continue without me. The trees know what to do. They've memorized my hands by now. They don't need them anymore. You saw at the orchard in winter. Branches bare, frost clinging to bark, and still alive beneath it all, just like him. I sleep longer now. Sometimes the morning comes, and I do not rise until the sun is well above the mountain. And when I do rise, it's with no urgency. There is nothing left I must prove, no sword to lift, no battle to brace for, no apology left unsaid. That one struck you, because in the end, maybe that's all any of us want to lay down without something left hanging in the air behind us. Some nights I dream of water, of the sound it makes when it slips over stones. I dream I am the water. No name, no weight, just movement. There was a pause in the scroll here. No words, just space, maybe to breathe, maybe to let. You feel the silence the way he did. I've begun writing shorter sentences. I do not need as many words as I once did. Each one matters more now. You look down at the final lines of the scroll. The ink here was faint, uneven, not rushed, but tired. I have loved this life. I have feared it, resisted it, scarred it, but I have also held it gently. And in return, it held me. That was the end of the ink. There was no signature, no date, no farewell, just a final breath on the page, and it was enough. You folded the scroll slowly, your hands moving without needing to think. Then you sat still for a long time, listening to the soft hush of the trees around you. And in that silence, you understood. The ink had run dry. But the story had not, because you were still here, reading, remembering, carrying it forward. You didn't rush this time. The scroll was wrapped in silk. Not white, not black, just a soft, weathered gray like the fog before dawn. A kind of gray that doesn't declare anything. It just is. You sat down where the wind died down, beneath an old pine whose roots had long since begun to show. A small stone rested there, hand-placed, you didn't know by whom, but you understood why you held. A final scroll like it was still warm from his hands, and when you opened it, it was, if you are reading this, then I am gone. The first line was clear, unshaken, not mourning, just truth. I don't know your name, or what brought you here, but if you found my letters, it means you are searching for something. Maybe peace, maybe understanding, maybe a reason not to pick up the sword. You inhaled, because it did feel like he was speaking directly to you. Know this, whatever path you walked before you came here does not define you. Not forever. It can teach you, it can shape you, but it does not own you. You looked up. The sky had begun to deepen, streaks of violet reaching across the blue. The day was breathing out. So were you? I have known fire. I have been its wielder, its victim, its shadow. But I have also known water. Gentle, patient, unstoppable. I lived long enough to become both. The next lines felt handwritten just for this moment, like the ink had waited until you were ready to read them. You will lose people. You will lose yourself. You will bury names you swore you'd never forget. You will kneel in places where nothing grows. But then, you will wake one morning to a blossom where none should have bloomed. And in that moment, you will understand. You closed your eyes and saw it. The winter flower, pink against frost, fragile, impossible, real. I do not ask you to remember me. I am not a legend. I am not a tale to be told in taverns. I am a man who chose to stay, to live beyond the fight, to make peace with the quiet. The next part had no punctuation, no rhythm, just heartbeat. If you've read this far, then the story is yours. Now what you do with it is up to you. Let it die. Let it grow. Plant it like a seed or carry it like a stone. I am gone, but you are not. And that is enough. You held your breath, then exhaled, because the scroll ended there. No more ink, no signature, no goodbye, just space, white space. A blank left for you to write the rest. You sat for a long time, not mourning, not lost, just remembering the scent of ink, the shape of silence, the feeling of a hand that reached across time and said, I understand. The scroll was blank. No ink, no message, just soft, creased parchment folded with care. And that was the message. You sat in the shadow of the pine tree, the last letter resting in your lap, and you realized what Tomo had meant all along. He wasn't asking you to follow him. He was asking you to live. You rose slowly, brushing the dirt from your hands. The stone beneath the tree was smooth. You didn't touch it, but you bowed your head, not to grieve, to honor, because this place wasn't a grave. It was a gate, and you were ready. The trail ahead was quiet. It didn't offer promises, didn't whisper of greatness or destiny, but it waited patient, soft, open, and that was more than enough. Your pack felt lighter now, not because it held less, but because you were heavier with memory, with meaning, with the quiet warmth of someone else's life echoing through your chest. You turned once, just before the last rise. No one was behind you, but you still nodded one final time to the orchard, to the ink, to the man who had once carried a sword and chose, in the end, to carry nothing at all. You walked, not with urgency, but with presence. The kind of walk that says, I've been somewhere, I've become something, and now I go forward, not to seek, not to escape, but simply to continue. And somewhere in the wind behind you, soft and invisible as snow falling on blossoms, you could almost hear a voice. Walk well. You've read the final scroll. The ink is dried, the sword has been buried, but something remains. Not a name, not a legend, just a trail. And it's yours now. You don't need armor. You don't need answers. Just your breath, your next step, and the quiet knowing that peace doesn't come after the journey. It's found while walking it. Sleep well, traveler. The story continues with you.